Let's talk about whether meditation and psychedelics will end all wars. The Dalai Lama, a few years ago, made a quote, and here's the quote by the Dalai Lama. If every 8-year old in the world is taught meditation, the world will be without violence within one generation. The American politician and presidential candidate Marianne Williams tweeted this. And her good friend Oprah Winfrey retweeted this to her 24 million followers, saying, "This I believe to be true. I have seen it." Now, here's the question: is it actually true? By the way, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Speaking to you as a meditator, as someone who's currently 47 years old. I started meditating when I was 14, so I have more than 3 decades of meditation experience under my belt. I've also spent the last 27 years seeing clients professionally, including people who depress, who anxietize, who suffer with phobias and chronic pain and anger issues. So I have a lot of experience in helping people using frameworks and techniques that are meditation based. So I am an advocate, but meditation also has its dark side, and it's extremely naive to presuppose that the Dalai Lama is right. The answer is actually no. To make such a claim, I would claim, and this might sound harsh, but to make such a claim, you have to either be extremely naive and gullible and know very little about the topic, or you have to be intellectually dishonest, or both. By the way, if you believe that meditation and psychedelics, if we could just get most people or everyone to meditate or teach meditation to every 8-year-old in the world, that will end the wars, you lack a even fundamental grasp of history. I would advise you to run out and buy this excellent book. It's called Zen War by Brian Victoria. It's an excellent book, and it documents how the Japanese military has used the doctrines of Zen Buddhism and meditation techniques to train soldiers to kill and to become kamikaze pilots and better assassins. And they've used Buddhist precepts such as emptiness, how everything is fundamentally empty, and enlightened selflessness as selling points. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this, and I'm quoting from the book The Buddha Pill here. Let's see here. So, the violent rhetoric of religious extremism is probably universal, but in the case of Zen Buddhism, it's very spiritual pinnacle. The attainment of enlightened selflessness was used to train soldiers during the Second World War who would sacrifice themselves as if their lives were of no consequence. Thus, an army major advised his soldiers. The soldier must become one with his superior. He must actually become his superior. Similarly, he must become the order he receives. That is to say, his self must disappear. Isn't this the ideal doctrines and philosophy to persuade and indoctrinate a soldier into? If you want the utmost obedience and conformity and someone who's willing to sacrifice his life as if it's nothing, if you can sell this idea of enlightened self-interest or selflessness, I should say. Here's another interesting quote. There's a kind of indifference or amorality about killing for people with a psychopathic personality. Although on the surface this seems the very opposite of what Buddhist practice is seeking to attain, something similar to this emotional indifference comes across in some Buddhist texts. One of the crucial teachings of Buddhism is that of emptiness. The self is ultimately unreal. So the bodhisattva who kills with full knowledge of the emptiness of the self kills no one. Both the self of the killer and the self of the killed are nothing more than an illusion. Isn't this great? Who needs a conscience? You know, killing ultimately isn't real because the self is an illusion, right? So this sort of ideology and these sorts of doctrines combined with meditation techniques prove to be highly effective. I'll give you a final one here. In the Nirvana Sutra, there's the story of a prince who killed his father so he could ascend the throne. And he had some remorse around this, so he went to the Buddha. And then Buddha states the unreality of killing. Great king, it is like the echo of a voice in the mountain valleys. The ignorant think it is a real voice, but the wise know it is not. Killing is like this. The foolish think it is real, but the Buddha knows that it's not. There's a lot of verses about, how the impersonal nature of the fire or forces of nature may kill, and it is the exact same thing with the bodhisattva when he comes from a place of selflessness and the killing spontaneously arises through him. He's not responsible for it, and there are no karmic consequences. Now, here's something interesting. There's a British prison psychiatrist, an author, who writes under the name of Theodore Dalrymple. I really like a lot of his books. He kind of leans on the conservative side politically. He's a very shrewd, very good writer. And he has this kind of autobiography called The Knife Went In. And he describes all these hilarious, tragic stories of the murderers that he spent time with. And one day it occurs to him during a conversation with his wife that the most common utterance he got from these murderers were, and then the knife went in. There would be some sort of story about what had happened, and then the knife went in. It was never I stabbed him or I did it. It was this complete abdication of any personal responsibility. The knife just did its thing. If you read Zen War, you'll see these passages too from Zen Buddhism where it's kind of described as if it's the sword that does the killing. So it's it's a very similar rhetoric in some ways, that of the kind of antisocial personalities and murderers in prison who have no sense of ownership or personal responsibility for what they have done because the knife just went in. So that would be my first argument, that if you look at books like Zen War, you will see that meditation and Buddhism has been used in this very way to get people to sacrifice to the emperor and to sacrifice to the state. So it completely depends upon the cultural context and the wider philosophical framework that you are using to interpret what could be called meditative insight through, right? So what people very often don't distinguish between is waking up, like waking up to the thing like self being a thought-created illusion on the one hand, versus growing up, and growing up more entailing your capacity to think about your thinking and to have perspective and to see your own shadow sides and to see contextual factors, these sorts of things. You could have a person who attained a satori or a kensho or had the realization that the self was an illusion, but whose meaning-making system, whose level of psychological maturity still operates from a very early stage. So let's say you have someone who's kind of embedded to his own psychologically perceived short-term needs and wishes. For that person, other people will be seen as suppliers to the self, so to speak. So this person might have the sense that he's not an agent, and it's just the mind behind all things speaking through him, right? But it's all going to be filtered through a pretty egocentric, shallow black and white thinking style. So here you could easily have the cult leader, or the meditation master who gets flown from Asia to, let's say, the United States, who ends up fucking all the attractive women and then swindling all the guys for money, right? That sort of thing. If we look at the examples I just made with the Zen soldiers, the when Brian Victoria's book Zen War was written, and it was translated into Japanese, he actually got a formal apology by many Zen teachers, because it was demonstrated that most of the, let's call it, enlightened meditation masters of the time and the Zen teachers were actually supportive of this Japanese militarism, right? So here you have an example of people who can have seemingly deep meditative insights, but they still operate from a very ethnocentric, racist, sexist model of the world. So if we take Robert Kegan's model of adult developmental psychology, he talks about a particular stage of development that he calls the socialized mind. And the socialized mind is the person who has kind of internalized the, let's call it, the doctrines of society in such a way that he is part of society and society is part of him. It might be nationalism. It might be a particular religious belief system. It might be the ideology of a particular political party. He internalizes that ideology, and his very sense of self is co-constructed through the ideology and how well he thinks he lives up to said ideology. So now we have a Christian, or a Muslim, or a environmentalist, or a Buddhist whose very sense of self is kind of co-constructed by the ideology that he has internalized. So someone again could have had some deep realizations on the meditation mat, but might still be operating from that socialized conformist mind, where you are one with the emperor and you are one with the order, and there's no self. So everything you do is kind of interpreted through that, right? Here's something. Here's something as compared to, for example, what you could call a more self-authoring mind, and that would be a meaning-making system where the person has more of a perspective on his or her indoctrination, where they've been able to psychologically take a step back and begin to have their own internal voice about the religious teachings or the political party or the culture, and there's more of that inner seat of authority, right? So here's something interesting too in terms of how meditation isn't a panacea. It's not necessarily going to make life better for all people at all times. So, for example, if you look at a lot of Asian societies, they are ethnocentric. They are societies which are quite tribal, where this socialized mind seems to be quite dominant, right? So a lot of talk about interconnection and stuff like that, but it's kind of a authoritarian societies with special rights for the in-group and not so much for the out-group, which is why you don't see a strong emphasis, or you really see things like freedom of speech or rule of law or universal human rights. But if you look at the Western world, for example, the Western world has developed the concept of the individual, and the individual is kind of the focus point for these rights. So that's a culture where that more people are more likely to develop more of that self-authoring mind. And once you do that, things like universal rights and rule of law and freedom of speech and you know these sorts of more world-centric principled attitudes can take shape. That is why the Western world is more evolved in a sense. If you were to spend time in a prison, for example, in Scandinavia versus Thailand or China, you wouldn't doubt that the Western world is more evolved in that sense. So for people who strongly operate from a kind of socialized mind, they haven't developed a sense of psychological self yet, separate from the group, which, psychologically speaking, is likely where nature wants to take them. So, a strong emphasis on selflessness here, for example, might be anti developmental and might actually hinder someone's psychological growth. Another example, if you look at some of the people who either struggle the most or who contribute to the most misery for other people, you could look at the so-called personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, dissocial personality disorder, right? One common histrionic personality disorder, one common denominator for these types of personality patterning is that these folks have not really developed a stable, seemingly autonomous sense of self. And to be able to develop that as an adult seems to be a prerequisite for having, intimate relationships and mutually supportive relationships, and to be able to make differentiations between your own inner life and someone else's inner life, and to truly respect someone else as an individual. This more individualistic stage seems a prerequisite to truly develop a more interconnected, systemic way of viewing the world or understanding life, right? So here's something else too in terms of meditation. Um, Quite a few people who start meditating have what you could call very unpleasant experiences, and this includes people who just do it once, right? So a lot of people will experience an increase in levels of anxiety or levels of depression, and might find those experiences extremely overwhelming. And then the question becomes, do they keep at it or do they drop out? Do they have a framework philosophically, psychologically, that allows them to make sense out of those experiences in ways that are useful? There are plenty of reports too of people who meditate, and this includes experienced meditators who have gone into manic episodes, psychotic breaks, plunged into deep depressions. And this includes people who otherwise have seemed to have had their shit together, especially during intense retreats. People who have taken their own lives. Something else, and also, a lot of people sometimes develop a kind of hypersensitivity towards their own body sensations. They might become extremely sensitive towards sounds or visual impressions or body sensations. And this kind of hypervigilance can drive them into extreme anxiety and panic attacks. This also happens for quite a few people who meditate. And there's a lot of liberation that can be found in seeing the self as an illusion, but it can also be extremely destabilizing. So if you look at what people describe as derealization or depersonalization, stuff like that, I felt that I disappeared, or I had the realization that everyone around me wasn't really real, or the boundaries between me and the world dissolved, or I lost all sense of agency. In the Western world, these sorts of experiences are very often diagnosed as evidence of mental illness. But if you look at meditators, these very often quite similar subjective experiences are interpreted as spiritual insights, as insights into the nature of experience, and labeled as a good thing. There's often a framework which allows people to find liberation in this. The reason why I mention this is because the very framework, the very philosophical understanding that you have, your capacity to reflect upon your experience can make a huge difference as to whether these shifts in perception or sense of self or agency are liberating, or whether they become seemingly torturous. I've had people who have realized that the whole notion of free will is a myth, and they have plunged into deep depression. I've also had people realize this who have found it extremely liberating. It's a bit like Sam Harris's book. You can give someone the book Free Will, and they can read the arguments, and for one person this is life changing in a positive direction, and for the other person it's extremely destructive, right? And the experiences themselves are not necessarily that different. And this also, of course, applies to psychedelics. I don't have that much experiences with it. I've done a couple of DMT trips and a little bit of mushrooms. But I've spoken to a lot of people who've done plenty of psychedelics, and once again, I'm pretty convinced that people who have had experiences that to them have been extremely liberating, the experiences are not necessarily that different from other people who have had similar experiences, but who has found it to be torturous, and which have really destabilized them. So I'm an advocate of meditation. Um, I highly recommend studying it, getting a good instructor. But be aware that there are dark sides to it. There are risks to a meditation practice. And there are other factors at play regarding whether someone is violent or not. So for example, let's say you have someone who had a psychopathic personality style, and they, had a spiritual awakening. Would that necessarily make them less psychopathic? Would it necessarily change their basic personality? Or one thing that you've probably noticed if you've been part of meditation communities is there's no shortage of people who are very narcissistic, who talk about the self being an illusion. So it might be seen clearly that there's no such thing as a self, but then the selfing program comes in and claims it as a realization, and now they build this spiritual identity of being an awakened person. So sometimes these sorts of awakening experiences can even contribute to increasing someone's sense of narcissism. It might also do the opposite. might also do the opposite. But one of my hunches is that meditative insights won't necessarily do much with these kind of more cluster B personality tendencies. Um, but again, it might. So by all means, study meditations, test psychedelics, but know that there are risks. There are a downside, and there's no reason to take quotes such as the one Dalai Lama made seriously. And there's no reason to think that Hitler would necessarily be any less evil had he just meditated. All right. By the way, know that I see clients from all over the world online. So if you like my way of thinking and you would like to see if you and I could be a good fit in terms of working together, I invite you to email me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2024, I have a six-part series coming up, online seminar here in May and June on how to work with clients who struggle with anxiety and all of its flavors. If you're curious about that, I invite you to check out the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com. All right, thanks for listening.